One of the things that Martin Bormann did in order to assure the success of the flight capital program was to set up 750 new corporations in neutral countries to handle the flight of the assets of the Third Reich. Paul Manning writes about this as follows. 750 new corporations were established in the last months of the war under the direction of Reich sleiter Bormann using the technique perfected by Hermann Schmitz. By the way, that's Hermann Schmitz of IG Farben, one of the luminaries of the IG, just like Dr. von Schnitzler. Continuing. A national of each country was the nominal head of each corporate structure, and the board was a mix of German administrators and bank officials, while the staffing at senior and middle management levels was comprised of German scientists and technicians. In the background were the shadowy owners of the corporation, those Germans who possessed the bearer bonds as proof of stock ownership. The establishment of such companies, usually launched in industries requiring high technical skills, was welcomed in Spain and Argentina, to give two examples, because those governments appreciated that German companies would generate jobs and implement a more favorable balance of trade. Country by country, a breakdown by U.S. Treasury investigators of these new 750 German firms was as follows. Portugal, 58, Spain, 112, Sweden, 233, Switzerland, 214, Turkey, 35, and Argentina, 98. More about the successful flight of German assets. The movement of German assets into Switzerland had also gone well, Bormann noted from his reports. Flight capital investments had been accomplished principally through the establishment of subsidiaries of powerful German firms. Over half the total German capital in Switzerland was used in setting up holding companies representing IG Farben, Merck, Siemens, Osram, Henkel, and others. By the way, I would note that the Merck company, a major German corporation, has been one of the major corporations involved with the U.S. post-World War II biological warfare program. It is also one of the largest manufacturers of vaccines in the world. It dispenses vaccines to the United States Army, and it also manufactured the experimental hepatitis B vaccine program, which many believe was responsible for the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. Continuing. Of the 750 companies and the holding companies for these major German corporations, Manning writes, a holding company may not trade in any form. It may only hold stock in other companies, but through this device, the existing German firms and the 750 new corporations established under the Bormann program gave themselves absolute control over a post-war economic network of viable, prosperous companies that stretched from the Ruhr to the neutrals of Europe and to the countries of South America, a control that continues today and is easily maintained through the bearer bonds or shares issued by these corporations to cloak real ownership. Bearer shares require no registration of identity, for such shares are exactly what they mean. The bearer of the majority shares controls the bearer of the majority shares controls the company without needing a vestige of proof as to how he acquired them. Thus, the Germans who participated as a silent force in Bormann's post-war commercial campaign, which is sometimes referred to by aging Nazis as Operation Eagle's Flight or Aktion Autoflug, ensured their command over the industrial and financial institutions that were to move the new Federal Republic of Germany back into the forefront of world economic leadership. In Switzerland, the most substantial investments were in chemicals and drugs and in electric power and equipment. German investments totaled $300 million, of which bank deposits, cash, and securities amounted to about $250 million, with direct investments about $50 million. In the German-Swiss clearings, Germany's debt, as the new year of 1945 began, was 1,000 million Swiss francs, or $232.1 million. Swiss investments in Germany and pre-war loans to Germany were $445 million. 6 Swiss private banks were now used by German firms in the flight capital program. H. Strutzenegger and C. Rochling & Company, Johann Verli & Company, Bank Wadenswil, Basler Handelsbank, and Kredenstalt. Again, I may be mispronouncing some of these names. However, all major Swiss banks were serving the Germans in the massive movement of funds. The big German banks, Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbank, all had their regular Swiss affiliations through which they worked. Deutsche had as its principal connection Credit Suisse and also did business with the Swiss Bank Corporation and the Banque Fédérale. Banks transferred from Berlin for a client list approved by Bormann went into numbered accounts, or funds transferred from Berlin for a client list approved by Bormann went into numbered accounts and were either held there for local investment or soon shifted to neutral nations elsewhere in Europe or overseas to be credited to the accounts of appropriate German corporate subsidiaries, or else to entirely new corporations awaiting these startup monies that would enable them to go into business using German patents. As these new corporations prospered, they generated more money and profits, becoming important elements in the Bormann global economic scheme. I would also note that one of the things that the Bormann Flight Capital Organization did very successfully was to acquire control over assets in the United States, and again, some of the cartel agreements between the major German corporations, which were the foundation of the Third Reich, and their American counterparts were profound. Of the Bormann Flight Capital Organization's acquisitions in America, Manning writes, "Throughout this period of asset transfer, Reichsleiter Bormann's goal was to have as much foreign exchange as possible in position in all neutral nations in both hemispheres. Aside from the Swiss banks, which made all currencies readily available in exchange for goods, trade, or gold bullion sales, the export of German products to neutral nations added to the general foreign exchange funds. Upon receipt of German goods, an agency in Spain, for example the Spanish Foreign Exchange Institute, would credit pesetas to a German-controlled import-export company. With such funds accumulating rapidly in Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, and Argentina, Bormann and his group, who were handling the fortunes of 750 new corporations, would use these corporations in neutral countries as cloaks for investing in American companies. Bormann always had a high regard for U.S. blue-chip stocks as a stable investment, consistently purchasing a vast number of shares from the European offices of such New York stock brokerage houses as Merrill Lynch on behalf of the Reich Chancellery and Hitler, until war became official between the United States and Germany, and the buying stopped for a time. In 1941, investments in U.S. corporations by German companies and assorted German individuals held voting ownership on 170, minority ownership was held in another 108 American companies. These businesses covered the following fields: manufacturing, foodstuffs, chemicals, electrical and automobile equipment, machinery and machine equipment, other metal products, petroleum production, refining and distribution, finance, trade, and miscellaneous. American industry, of course, had a financial stake in German industry. In the same year, 1941, 171 U.S. corporations had major investments in German firms amounting to $420 million. A listing of these corporations is identical to the general categories under German ownership in the United States. When Bormann gave the order for his representatives to resume purchases of American corporate stocks, it was usually done through the neutral countries of Switzerland and Argentina. From foreign exchange funds on deposit in Swiss banks and in Deutsche Südamerikanische Bank, the Buenos Aires branch of Deutsche Bank, large demand deposits were placed in the principal money center banks of New York City: National City, now Citibank; Chase, now Chase Manhattan N.A., Manufacturers and Hanover, now Manufacturers Hanover Trust; Morgan Guaranty, and Irving Trust. Bear in mind that Manning is writing here in 1981. Such deposits are interest-free, and the banks can invest this money as they wish, thus turning tidy profits for themselves. In return, they provide reasonable services such as the purchase of stocks and transfer or payment of money on demand by customers of Deutsche Bank, such as representatives of the Bormann business organizations and Martin Bormann himself, who has demand accounts in 3 New York City banks. They continue to do so. The German investment in American corporations from these sources exceeded $5 billion and made the Bormann economic structure a web of power and influence. Indeed, and again, I believe that ultimately, if the history of the world is ever properly written, I believe the Bormann organization will prove to be the decisive element in human affairs, at least in the 20th and 21st centuries, and it is my analysis that the future ultimately will be theirs. We're going to continue with our analysis of the Bormann Flight Capital Organization, one of the most remarkable political, financial, and military achievements of all time, in the next half-hour segment. That concludes this segment. My name is Dave Emery. Thanks for listening.